we were trying to make a kind of a serious movie, a Godzilla, monster movie, destruction movie, what have you, but really a serious movie at the same time.
This is a very special day. We have a guest on the channel today. I guess I could call you an industry legend. I don't know what you would call yourself, but he's worked on a lot of things: Speed, Face Off, Batman Forever. But specifically for today's purposes, Jan de Bont's Godzilla, it's Boyd Shermis. So you can introduce yourself however you'd like.
Hi, I'm Boyd Shermis. I don't know that I'd call myself a legend so much, but an industry veteran, certainly. There's a number of colleagues of mine who have been in the business for in excess of 30 years, and I myself have been doing it for 30 years or more than. Legend, yeah, I'll leave that to the viewers.
But so I guess I think a good place to start is what do you think initially got you into the VFX direction?
To be honest with you, it was strictly by chance. I'm actually a musician by training, and spent all my years at university doing that. And it was really just in service of having a day job that I landed a position at a visual effects company, a company that some of your older viewers may know, called Apogee. And that was one of the earlier generations of modern visual effects facilities here in the Valley, San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles, back in the mid 80s. And I literally just landed a job doing purchasing for that company and worked my way up through the facility to the point where I was supervising and directing commercials for them. And eventually left that company and went out freelance and was doing visual effects supervision for feature films.
You're credited as a VFX supervisor for most of your stuff. Do you maybe want to explain exactly what that job is?
Visual effects supervisor, it can be different things for different people who do it, who practice it. But by and large, I'll say an easy answer is when you're working on something like a film or even television, that you are responsible, I am responsible for the technical and creative direction of the visual effects as they relate to the film or the television project. And by that, you might be thinking about things like pre-visualization on the creative side of things, or as you design shots and work with the director and the editors and producers to craft a sequence of shots that you bring everything that you can, everything your experience gives you to participate in those conversations so that you design exciting, meaningful, sometimes emotional, and certainly in terms of continuity, making sure that you can tell that story the way everyone wants to tell it. And then there's sort of the technical side of things where you are responsible for calling out the techniques, how you're going to do it, what kind of equipment are we going to need, and what companies employ those techniques and that kind of equipment that we might hire for the job, and assessing the talent of the people that you hire alongside you. And very often, most often, when you're dealing with a larger feature film and larger television shows, you've got an entire department that you're responsible for to delegate various tasks that are in support of all of those efforts.
So I guess, how did you first meet Jan de Bont?
So I first met Jan doing a handful of commercials. We did a number of Dodge trucks and Dodge car commercials, and eventually we ended up doing. How did I meet him, though? That's a darn good question. I think it was just word of mouth. I mean, when I started out, there weren't that many people doing what I was doing in commercials. So there weren't that many choices, and I had a pretty good reputation for doing the commercial work at that time. And you have to remember, at that time, it was that transitional period between what I'll call film optics, the old optical compositing, where you had to do things analog on an optical printer and with hand rotoscope and that kind of thing. And commercials at that time, television being a lower definition, a lower standard of resolution, we were able to do commercial resolution on the brand new digital toolboxes that were just coming out in early 80s, mid 80s. And so I got very good at that technique, those techniques, and working with the digital tool sets, doing commercials. And so frankly don't really remember how I met him, but I started doing commercials with Jan. We did a whole, I don't know, several packages of the Dodge. We ended up directing and then co-directing some Coca-Cola commercials. And so I got to know him pretty well. And it was just after the Coca-Cola commercials that he was offered his first film as a feature director to do Speed. And I think, I don't want to say I was the only one he knew, but certainly he was comfortable with me. And at the time asked me to do it and asked me if I was interested in doing it. And, you know, I was being honest with him. I hadn't to that point been interested in doing feature films because it was still being done photochemically with film opticals. And the tool sets were just starting to catch up to what at that time was 2K resolution to do quality feature film work. So I kind of hemmed and hawed a little bit, but ultimately I decided there was enough of the working tool sets in digital, you know, compositing and 3D work, CGI, that I said yes. And, you know, it was a great decision in the end.
Actually, I do want to get back to that, like commercial and stuff like that. And I know a lot of people like Ridley Scott and like people just get started with commercials and then they move on.
I did a number of commercials with Ridley as well.
That's awesome. So for Godzilla and everything, there was a lot of talk about like the budget being ridiculously high, like a bunch of sources, and like I kind of scaled it to like inflation, like some as high as like in the 200 millions it could have been. So were you guys having to like innovate techniques and stuff for that movie, or like was there going to be anything new?
It would have been, yes. You know, we of course didn't get to make that version of it at the time, and it certainly wasn't going to be. Well, actually, the total film budget, yeah, you're right, might have been close to 200 million. The visual effects were approaching 100 million. They were certainly over 80 in the budgeting that we were doing. And we didn't get to develop all the techniques, but one of the things that we did have to do, in fact, was to build into our budgets the fact that we did need to create new ways of doing things. For example, the water technology at the time was nowhere near what it turned out to be, 10 years later when I did Poseidon, for which we had to develop new water technology. And we were going to do things not terribly dissimilar in that version of Godzilla as I ended up doing for the Poseidon film. And so we were going to have to create new ways of doing water. We were going to have to create new ways of dealing with the scale of Godzilla. And you have to remember, even in something like Jurassic Park, which had been done obviously quite successfully by that point, and that was one of our sort of benchmarks that we were using, there was nothing approaching the scale of Godzilla. And dealing with that scale and the kind of destruction that imparts, doing those kind of effects in combining the CGI versions of it and the practical destruction and that sort of thing just hadn't been done at that scale at that point. And so, yes, we had, in fact, budget to do things that hadn't been done before, which you always have to add in a good percentage for the unknown because you just don't know.
So on the kinds of special effects, obviously CG was going to be used, but did you know if your guys were going to do like mocap or even any animatronics or stuff like that? Because I know Stan Winston had some involvement in it too.
Well, Stan was, we were in conversations with Stan, and Jan and I both felt, and no disrespect to Stan or any of his work and any of the people who worked with him, but we both felt that, once again, because of the scale, the idea of trying to create an animatronic and even just small sections of, his foot was going to be 12 feet tall or 20 feet tall and weigh several thousand pounds. And just trying to get those animatronics to work at that scale were just not going to be practical, just from a filmmaking standpoint, both in terms of really trying to actuate those things, but as well just trying to get it on the set and make it work take after take. It just, we didn't think that was the right approach. And we did talk to Stan, and we talked to the people at Digital Domain in great detail about how we might approach the film. And there was another side of it too. And again, no disrespect, but there were elements to Jurassic Park that we referenced, and our least favorite parts were those that were animatronic versus what they were doing in the CG versions thereof. And so we just felt, though, that in terms of performance and sheer practicality, that it just didn't make sense in the end, with very few exceptions. And I can only think of one off the top of my head from that script and in the storyboards that we generated that would have been appropriate for an animatronic. But, we did listen to Stan and his people a great deal for several months.
So I read a little bit about how there was going to be like 3D CGI models of like New York City and stuff, and they would eventually do that in King Kong 2005. At that point, had anything like that been done before, like creating an entire 3D model of a city?
Not to my knowledge. I know that they were working on things a couple of years later, and they did stuff for Matrix, for example. A few years later. But at that time, no, not to my knowledge. And once again, that was one of those things that, we had a budget for huge things that had never been done before. And, it's not uncommon that people are asking you to do something that's never been done before, but the whole movie, everything about that movie hadn't been done really at that scale. And it was just going to be the way that Jan wanted to do it. And certainly the way I wanted to do it. It was just massive, and we had to budget for it. And, in the end, that budget made the studio choke, I think, just a little bit. But there was another component to it. I don't think it was entirely our budget that made them stop. There was no one will remember this, but Sony Pictures, who was the studio at the time, had a huge financial loss that particular year. Yep. I mean, they lost, I don't know, a couple $1 billion or something. And so the studio took a huge write down, and it was as much because of that, I believe anyway, that they just decided they didn't want to spend that kind of money, $200 million on a movie. And today they do it all the time, but you're talking 20 some odd years ago. And it was a lot of money. So they balked.
So there is one interesting bit that I found when I was doing some research. It's a video. It claims that it's previs from the movie. So I was going to see if you could confirm or deny.
Well, if you want to describe what it is, I can tell you if it's real or not. I think
it is the Golden Gate Bridge sequence.
Fake.
All right.
Not from our film. That's not to say somebody else didn't do one at some point. And to that, it may not be fake, but in terms of what we managed to pull off in our pre-production, we didn't do any previs on the Golden Gate Bridge.
So you did do previs then, but it was something different.
Well, we did some tests.
Okay.
And I won't say that we prevised any sequences of the film. We did tons of storyboards, tons of them.
Yeah.
But we didn't do any what we now refer to as previs. We actually did, believe it or not, Jan and I were one of the first people that I know of anyway, that did previs on speed, going back to 1993. It really wasn't a common thing at that time, but there was a particular title sequence that had to be timed out just right. People don't care about this necessarily, but the opening title sequence to speed is timed out for the titles very accurately, down to the frame, frankly.
That big elevator sequence.
Yeah. You're right. You're traveling down the elevator and it's wiping off and on various title names. And that had to be timed out before we went to shoot it in the miniature. Because that entire piece is a miniature that's spliced together in several ways. But in any case, we didn't get to the point of previs on that film. We did do some tests. It was primarily done with John Fraser and his team, where they smashed a hut. It's like an island hut, and Godzilla comes in and stomps his foot on it. And we did a little piece where they demolished in practical effects. And by the way, we were going to do a lot of this. We're talking a lot of digital for Godzilla now, but John Fraser and his team were going to be hugely involved in doing a lot of the destructive components of that film. And for that, we did do this quick test where Godzilla's foot comes in and stomps on this hut and just flattens it. And, we got a little Godzilla foot in there and that sort of thing. And John and his team just flattened the hut in a practical sense. It looked great. It was going to be great, no question. But that was really the only thing that we managed to pull off in our period of pre-production.
So that was probably for the fishing village scene then, because
yes.
I read that was the first one that Jan was going to shoot, but obviously they didn't get to right before it was pulled. So
right, no, we were actually going to shoot that as part of our pre-production, and we did get to set up some of that testing as I was just describing, but that's as far as it got. Right after we finished that little test and turned in our budget, we got shut down.
That's a bummer.
Yeah. We were all very bummed for a long time. Trust me.
I don't know. You maybe kind of already answered this, but I guess in terms of movie terms, how far along do you think this thing was when it got pulled? Was it close to being made? Was it not really? Was it even officially greenlit or?
It was never officially greenlit, and that's the term, just for you and your viewers. There's a term for actors and directors called pay or play, where studio commits to making the movie by ultimately committing to the actors and the directors and their paychecks. And we weren't to that level. We weren't to that point. We were in pre-production. We did 6 months or more of pre-production, which on a film of this size is not great. I mean, that's not to say that's not a huge amount of pre-production for a film of this size. But we were starting to roll cameras, to the point where we were testing things. And very often in pre-production, you call your first couple of shoot days test days so that they show up on a different balance sheet. And we did manage to get 1 or 2 of those test days off, but it was right before they were going to commit to the green light was when they shut it down.
So in Speed, how many of those big sequences were they all CG? The bus going into the plane and the first bus blowing up, and were there any practical for any of that?
Oh, there was a lot of practical. Once again, it was with John Fraser once again, and John's great. His whole team are great, and they pull off some of the biggest stunts that you've ever seen in Hollywood. So and they calculate what they're doing by the thousands of pounds of steel and explosives that they're going to use. So they do it on a very large scale. First of all, the bus explosion near the beginning of the film, that's all practical. Didn't have anything to do with that. Really, the big sequences for me in Speed, I know there's a couple of minor ones along the way, but the big sequences were the elevator, from the opening of the elevator sequence to the point at which it crashes down into the floor and everything in between. Anytime you're outside the elevator box and you're up there in the truss of the whole thing, you're inside the structure of the building looking down or up at the elevator shaft. All that was done with visual effects, but almost exclusively miniatures, with the exception of when the winch that's pulled off the roof, there's a winch that's holding the elevator car up. And once the bolts on that snap, that winch and its cable were done in 3D CGI. But everything else about the elevator shaft was all done as miniatures, believe it or not. The subway train, runaway train sequence that happens near the end, that was all miniatures with some CGI enhancements. A lot of motion control and miniatures on that. There were a handful of matte paintings, and there was the sequence where the bus is jumping the gap in the freeway that were a combination of practical and visual effects. And the bus really does jump. However, it doesn't jump over a gap. It jumps over a filled-in section of freeway, wherein I and my team then took out that section of freeway and made it appear as though there's a gap below.
Right. I was wondering how that was done. I was like, they didn't really jump that, but okay.
But the bus does jump, quite a distance. It goes up in the air and it comes and lands, and it doesn't jump 60 feet through the air, but it jumps. It's through the magic of editing. You think it's jumping that far, but it's probably jumping 20 feet or something. But we're able to make it appear that you're 70, 80 feet in the air, something like that.
Yeah, and then one of the other scenes I always was thinking about was when Keanu Reeves is actually underneath the bus. I was like, is that real? And were they just actually not driving that fast, or was that?
Yeah, well, they weren't driving that fast, but it is real. He's He's underneath there quite a bit. In fact, he was a good sport. He did a lot of stunts for that film that most actors wouldn't do today, certainly.
So one of my friends is a fan of Batman. So he said, with all the talk going on about the Joel Schumacher cut of Batman Forever, was there any unused VFX that didn't make the final cut? If you know about deleted scenes or anything like that.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any visual effects scenes that were cut. I will tell you, I was shocked at one point at some of the more elaborate sets and scenes photographed within those sets that were just, I don't want to say arbitrarily cut, but, you know, on an editorial whim were cut. You know, I see it happen in film work often where, you know, they'll spend a couple of days shooting a scene, and in a couple of days on a movie is many hundreds of thousands of dollars. And, you know, you get into the editing room and somebody decide, you know what, we don't need that scene. Forget it. It's, you know, it could be $1 million just right on the cutting room floor.
That's the power of the editor.
Yeah, no, it really is. But you have to make the story work. And sometimes, you know, when you're out shooting, you shoot everything you possibly can, and anything that you think is going to make sense or help the movie. That's your one chance to do it. So you do it then. But oftentimes you realize you don't need it. And certainly you don't need all the coverage. You know, for every shot you see in a movie, there's 3 other angles or more, you know, of the same action that don't get used.
Did you see any Godzilla movies prior to working on the movie?
Oh yeah, no, I think I watched every one that we could get our hands on, but mostly as a reference of what we didn't want to do. Oddly enough, you know, there's certainly and I don't mean to infuriate or insult any fanboys, because people do love that, you know, the stuff from the 50s and 60s, and, you know, going back as far as it goes. People love it, whether it's because it's campy or because they really get into it. I don't know. I won't speak for them. But when Jan and I were looking at it together, it was like, all right, well, we don't want to do that. We don't want a guy in a rubber suit. We don't want, you know, we knew that, or we felt that almost everything about the way it had been photographed, the way that, you know, he is rendered as a creature, both, you know, sort of physically on camera, but emotionally as well. You know, we really, so you think about flashing forward a couple decades, you know, when you look at a King Kong movie, you read emotion in King Kong's face, and you look at Godzilla even, you go, oh yeah, now he's really pissed off, or now he's heartbroken, or whatever. You can read that on their faces. And there was nothing about any of those early incarnations where you could see any of that emotion. And we wanted to bring that to Godzilla. We wanted to make sure that you read him. He was the main character in that film. You know, he was going to be the star of the show. And so we wanted to make sure that you could read everything about him in his performance.
Right. I mean, yeah, the newer Godzilla movies have been doing that because, I mean, they have all the super capabilities and budgets. So.
Right. And just technology now. You just didn't really have it back then. You know, you didn't see, even on some of the Jurassic Park, you didn't read a lot of emotion on any of the digital dinos' faces. I mean, a little bit, but not a lot. But we really wanted to bring that to Godzilla, and there was nothing in the earlier versions that we saw that we wanted to emulate. Virtually nothing.
So this question, and actually does kind of lead into something that I didn't even ask about, but I'm curious about. So this question was, do you know how big Godzilla and the Gryphon were going to be? Which brings up the Gryphon. That was probably going to be a bitch to animate. I know the design wasn't final, but that thing looked kind of crazy from the concept.
Oh, yeah. He was going to be probably more difficult than Godzilla. You know, I don't know. Maybe not. I think maybe one of the advantages to the Gryphon is that more often than not, you know, he was in the air, or he certainly had that ability, and so he's not grounded. And one of the more difficult things very often, the tough thing about both these characters, but particularly Godzilla, is that he was like, I don't know, 300 feet tall or whatever. I forget offhand, and forgive me, I don't remember all the specs now. But, you know, he was as tall as a building. I think like 30 stories or more, you know, 300 feet tall, let's say. That getting all of that in camera, you know, grounding him on the ground and showing his face in what was going to be an anamorphic film where your aspect ratio is wide, not tall. It was going to be a cinematic challenge, not just to physically get him in frame, but to ground him and keep him in frame and to keep it the context of where he is and what he's doing and not feel like you're 6 blocks away, in order to get that in camera. So it was going to be a challenge in a lot of ways. And, it was one of the things that had been working on in our storyboards. And with the, Jan was a director of photography prior to moving into directing. So he had a pretty good sense of what he wanted to do. But, we really had to think hard about how we were going to lens that film. It wasn't going to be easy.
This is actually a pretty good question that someone asked. Did you feel a lot of responsibility working on a Godzilla movie, especially the first American one at that point?
Yeah, I really did. I mean, there was a huge weight, but both for the fanboys, in particular for the studio. You always try to cultivate those relationships at studios, so you try to do your best work and bring everything you can, and that's just forgetting everything else. I always try to do the best thing that I can do. I mean, if I can't do my best work, I sort of lose interest a little bit. And it was a big challenge, and I was taking it very, very seriously and spending all my time trying to figure out how we were going to do it and trying to round up the team that was going to be able to do it. And on top of all of that, Toho was very involved. And they wanted to make sure that this first big American version was going to be a huge success. And so they were very on top of what we were doing in terms of design, in terms of the script, in terms of the production execution that we were planning. It was a ton of pressure.
I should have been naming the people who have been asking this. This is FC Cool Guys' name. But this is a good question because about your talk about like water textures, Godzilla's atomic breath. Do you guys know how you were going to approach that or make the look of it like fire, or like, do you even know what you guys were going to do for that?
I don't think we'd gotten that far, to be honest with you. I don't remember. If we had, I honestly don't remember what we'd been doing in pursuit of that. I think initially, the time that I'd spent to that point on the film was really more about how we were going to get that creature with that scale and scope and weight and, giant musculature and all of that, and get him in and out of the water. Because water had been done at that point, CGI water, but not in a volumetric way. It had all been done sort of in just a very surface tension way. And he needed to be not just splashing the surface, he needed to be in and out of the water and bringing up hundreds of thousands of gallons of water as he's doing it. It's got to drip off of his body, and it's ocean water, so it's got to get all foamy and atomize as spray and all that, which just didn't exist at all back then. All of those things, really. Just dealing with a volume of water just hadn't been done. I mean, it was just all pure scientific theory in terms of computer calculation. So that, I think that's really where the bulk of my effort was, trying to figure out the skeleton and, just how to make him feel like he's gigantic in terms of the speed at which he moves and, how easily does he topple a building and that sort of thing.
You mentioned Digital Domain earlier. I read a thing about how they did that. I think it was them that did the Rolling Stones music video where they had the giant sized people in the city.
Indeed.
Was that why you guys got them involved in it?
No. I mean, I'd seen that. I'd done some prior work at Digital Domain, particularly when I was doing commercials. And even when we did Speed, I approached them, but they weren't available because they were working on True Lies, Jim Cameron's film, at the very same time. And so they weren't available to us on Speed. But I'd built relationships between my commercial work and that Speed effort at Digital Domain. And so I knew the people there very well. And I'd seen the work that they had done on that video even before it came out. But, again, that was just done with, match moves and scale the camera moves and that sort of thing, which isn't trivial, mind you, but it was nothing like what we were going to try and do with Godzilla by any means. Unless you're thinking, oh, Rolling Stones were all 3D deep fakes, but they weren't. They were all real, and it was much easier to do than what we were thinking about in Godzilla.
Kathleen Morris asks, how did you feel about Sony's eventual Godzilla from 1998? I know what Jan thinks about that because he's had plenty of interviews, but what did you
really?
think?
I don't think I've ever read anything that he's had to say about it, and I never like to diss anybody's work. I think it was ImageWorks who did most of the CG work on it, if I'm not mistaken. And it wasn't bad. And, 2.5, 3 years later, whenever it came out, I don't even remember now. They had the advantage of those couple of years to build some pipelines and things like that. And, it certainly wasn't the movie we had set out to make. And I don't think it had the impact, certainly not the emotional impact that we had intended to bring to it, or necessarily the scale of destruction that we had intended to bring. Roland has his own style, and love him or hate him, he just likes big and bombastic, and more is better. Whereas I think Jan was a little bit more auteur about it. That is to say, he wanted to make it more about Godzilla and his journey. I know it sounds kind of goofy to some, perhaps, but he really wanted to make Godzilla the character and not just one of 1,000 dinosaurs running around the city, as we saw in Roland's version.
They used a lot of practicals in that movie, actually.
Yeah,
they had
I think so.
The big bust of Godzilla. That was pretty cool. But so a lot of people had actually wanted to know your opinion on the current Godzilla Kong MonsterVerse movies. And a funny thing about that is that Terry Rossio, who wrote Jan's Godzilla, wrote the story for Godzilla versus Kong. So that's a funny connection.
Well, first of all, just in terms of the visual effects work that they do, it's nearly flawless. They do fantastic work. I mean, it's very hard to criticize much of anything that they're doing. In fact, I would praise it without criticism whatsoever. I'm not a huge fan of monster movies per se. I don't mean to disappoint your audience, certainly. But I don't necessarily go to see those films for the excitement of seeing them. I certainly do go to see them. I take my membership in the Academy seriously. And, I try to see the films and watch them for the quality of work as I cast my vote. So I do go to see them with that intention, but they're not my favorite kind of entertainment per se. So I won't necessarily pass judgment on them as films, but the visual effects work is stunning. They do great stuff.
Especially Kong Skull Island. Like, I think like CGI, like apes and monkeys, like they look so, especially the Planet of the Apes movies too, they look so realistic now.
Yeah. And there's another film that I don't know if you or any of your audience has seen, the one and only Ivan. Phenomenal ape work. I don't think it was a big hit or anything. And it just came out this year. It was probably just streaming on Disney Plus or something. But it's up for an Academy Award in terms of nominations. And it's stunning ape work. I mean, it's flawless, as are the other, Planet of the Apes films and things, like King Kong, what have you. Those are just amazing.
I guess the last fan question here is from Jared Osborne. What's your favorite film or project you've ever worked on?
My favorite experience, I think, was was Poseidon. And it's a film that not that many people saw, and even fewer thought it was a good film. But I will say that in terms of the production and the support and just the way it was organized and the way that everyone worked together to make it a success visually anyway, was second to none. I mean, it was just the best experience, the best crew, the best, the director Wolfgang Peterson directed, just an incredible experience.
All right. So that was all the questions that I have. If you have anything else that, maybe I didn't ask about Godzilla that that you could include, or if you want to talk about any future projects you have or anything, you can. Yeah,
I won't discuss any of that for the moment. But, in terms of things relative to Godzilla, I don't know. There were a handful of other companies that we were talking to for visual effects. That included a company called PDI, Pacific Data Images, that became the animation wing of DreamWorks eventually. And one of the reasons that things kind of got, I don't want to say messy, but the difficulty in budgeting and figuring out our budget was that at the very same time that we were putting our budget together and about to turn it in, this company PDI was being absorbed by DreamWorks. And once again, it became their animation department. And it kind of pulled the rug out from under us just a little bit because they were going to be one of the big companies working on the film for us. There was another company involved called Video Image that's long since gone. or VFX, they were also known as. And I'd done a handful of films with them, including Batman Forever. And I did a little Speed with them, a little Batman Forever, and a little bit of Pushing Tin. And so they were going to be part of it as well. They were sort of at the cutting edge of things at the time. So we had a couple of those big companies that were prepared to, sort of divide and conquer the huge project that Godzilla was. I got to tell you, it really surprised me. I know that there are fanboys or fans of the films, but I had no idea that people were that interested in an aborted film attempt. It's actually, I don't want to say it amuses me, but I really do find it interesting and to some degree incredible that there's people out there like yourself digging around trying to find any information you can find on that film, and I just find that amusing. I don't know. Forgive me.
I mean, a lot of the appeal is that the Roland Emmerich movie, like the fan base doesn't like. We don't like it at all. Like I don't think it's a good Godzilla movie at all. So like a lot of people see Terry Rosio's story and like see what Jan said about it and see like Stan Winston's designs and they're like, oh, this looks so much better. And people just kind of like wish that was the version that happened.
And again, you brought it up, and so I'll just say when I saw it, because I knew what we were trying to do with it. When I saw the Roland's version of it, I go, okay, well, not exactly what we had in mind. But, he did have a mandate to keep it within a certain budget. And he and his team managed to do that. So, props to him for doing that. We couldn't keep it within that same budget, I know, for a fact at the time. But we were, like I said, we were trying to make a kind of a serious movie, a Godzilla, monster movie, destruction movie, what have you, but really a serious movie at the same time.
All right. Well, that was Boyd Shermis, everybody. I know you probably can't say secret projects you have, but if there's any of your projects that you would recommend, I know you said Poseidon. If people want to go see that, I'll probably check it out now that you said that. But
well, if you do go check out Poseidon, one thing to note on it, certainly the opening title sequence is another one that we prevised the heck out of it and spent well over 6 months figuring that title sequence out down to the frame of film. And it's like 3 minutes long. The other thing is just in general, the scope of the ship and the water, it was brand new water technology that we developed at ILM for that film. And for the shots that ILM did. And as well, there was a brand new water technology that came out of Scanline and MPC for all the interior water work. So, that was all cutting edge stuff at the time. The only other thing I'll say, future, there's a great show coming out on Netflix. I'm not saying I worked on it at all because I haven't, but there's a great show coming out called Cowboy Bebop that may have something to do with, I don't know. We'll see.
All right. Well, I'll keep my eye out for that. So,
okay.
Thanks everyone and thank you for coming, and thanks everybody for watching.
Cheers.
Right, cool.
Thanks for having me.